Imagine a machine where you can pour in $1 billion of capital, and instead of generating a profit, the machine simply destroys local businesses, captures millions of addicted users, and then demands another $2 billion just to keep the lights on. Are you looking at a spectacular financial disaster? Or, are you looking at the most brilliant business model of the 21st century? Welcome to Cognitive Dose. We are here, as always, curing blind spots and shattering cognitive bias.
Today we are dissecting, honestly, one of the most pervasive and frankly dangerous frameworks in modern business strategy. I mean, we're talking about Reid Hoffman and Chris Yee's best-selling book, Blitzscaling.
Right.
And we are evaluating this methodology alongside a really devastating new academic critique titled The Epistemology of Ruin.
Yeah, so the central question before us today is this. Is blitzscaling a revolutionary, mathematically sound blueprint for building massively valuable companies in the digital age? Or is it a localized, mathematically flawed artifact of a bygone economic era?
Exactly.
I will be outlining the objective mechanics of the blitzscaling framework. We are going to explore exactly how and why prioritizing raw speed over operational efficiency allows companies to dominate these winner-take-all markets.
And I will be relentlessly cross-examining this doctrine. I will expose it as a manifestation of systemic bias, data manipulation, and corporate malfeasance that completely collapses under macroeconomic scrutiny.
Well, let's start with the foundational mechanics of the theory. To understand blitzscaling fairly, without immediate argumentation, we have to look at the specific environment it was designed for.
Okay.
What the authors call the networked age. Over the past couple of decades, the internet has fundamentally altered the physics of business. It created distribution channels with essentially zero marginal cost, and more importantly, it unleashed massive network effects.
Right, the network effect.
Yeah, and for the listeners, a network effect simply means a product becomes more valuable purely because more people are using it. So if I own the only telephone in the world, it is a useless piece of plastic. But if 1 million people own one, it is an indispensable tool.
That is the standard premise, yes.
Right. And in that specific environment, the objective is to achieve what Hoffman calls a first scalar advantage. The core mechanism of blitzscaling is the intentional sacrifice of efficiency for speed, even in environments of extreme uncertainty.
Extreme uncertainty.
Right. And the logic is grounded in how modern tech markets operate. The authors use I think it's a brilliant analogy from the movie Glengarry Glen Ross.
Oh, I know this one.
Yeah. In traditional business, multiple companies can comfortably share a market. But in modern tech, first prize is absolute market control, the Cadillac Eldorado.
Right.
Second prize is marginal survival, like a set of steak knives. And third prize is irrelevance. I mean, first prize in early social networking went to Facebook. Second prize went to MySpace. Third went to Friendster.
Sure.
You have to win first prize to survive. And the mechanism to win is scaling so aggressively that you build an insurmountable network effect before anyone else can react.
Assuming, of course, that your competitors are standing completely still, which they rarely do.
Which is exactly why speed becomes your only defense. Look, the ultimate success story of this framework in action is Airbnb. Let's look at how this mechanism actually works in practice. Back in 2011, Airbnb was a scrappy startup.
Very scrappy.
They had about 40 employees and maybe a few million in funding. Just as they were gaining traction, they faced a deadly threat. The Samwer brothers from Germany.
Ah, yes, the clone factory.
Right, who were notorious for cloning American business models. They launched a European copycat called Wimdu. And Wimdu did not start small. They raised $90 million, hired 400 employees in a matter of weeks, and opened 20 offices across Europe.
Just aggressive capital.
Right. They essentially marched up to Airbnb's CEO, Brian Chesky, and said, "Give us a 25% stake in your company, or we will take Europe, and then we will use European revenue to crush you in America."
Extortion by capital.
Exactly. Chesky was facing a binary choice. If he focused on careful, efficient growth, if he took the time to build proper management structures and perfect his unit economics, Wimdu would take Europe by sheer force.
So he threw out the rule book.
He chose to blitzscale. He raised $112 million and embarked on an incredibly aggressive, highly inefficient global expansion plan. In a matter of months, Airbnb opened 9 international offices. They entered complex regulatory markets they barely understood.
Total chaos.
They hired furiously, entirely prioritizing speed over operational integrity. They essentially fought chaos with chaos, and the mechanism worked. By choosing to grow at this breakneck pace, Airbnb established the dominant global network effect. They crushed Wimdu and built an unassailable position. It really is this brilliant, lightning-fast blueprint that completely rewrites the fundamental laws of business because...
I'm going to stop you right there.
Uh-huh.
I am sorry, but I entirely reject that premise. This entire framework is an illusion. What you just described with Airbnb is not a replicable science. It is a dangerous cocktail of logical fallacies, unethical market manipulation, and counterfeit capitalism.
Counterfeit capitalism?
Yes, you are looking at a methodology that was artificially sustained by a very specific economic climate, and you are treating it as if it's the law of gravity.
Look, I see why you might be skeptical of FEEP's extreme risk profile, but let me give you a different perspective. The empirical success of this strategy is undeniable.
Is it?
Yes! We aren't just talking about one lucky break with Airbnb. We are looking at the foundational architecture of unicorns like Uber, Amazon, and Tencent's WeChat. I mean, WeChat went from an internal idea to 300 million users in under 2 years.
Right.
To achieve that velocity, Hoffman outlines very specific, counterintuitive rules. You have to tolerate bad management. You have to let fires burn.
Let fires burn.
Yeah. When a company is growing at 300% a year, the math dictates that you literally do not have the hours in the day to build a perfect human resources department or fix every broken internal process. You must accept internal chaos as the necessary cost of capturing the market.
And that logic is fundamentally backward. Let me tell you exactly why. The entire methodology is built on a fatal foundation of survivorship bias.
Survivorship bias?
It elevates extreme statistical anomalies to the status of a replicable science. It is the classic Colosseum fallacy.
The idea that the arena creates the warrior?
Precisely. An observer watches gladiators fight in the Roman Colosseum. They look at the battered survivors and conclude, wow, fighting in the Colosseum makes men incredibly tough. That is a massive logical error.
Because they were already tough.
Right. The Colosseum doesn't forge toughness. It merely exposes who was already the most exceptionally fit, or frankly, who experienced the most stochastic luck. It brutally filters out the rest. You are looking at the survivors of this chaotic blitzscaling strategy and attributing their survival to the brutal conditions, rather than recognizing that they survived in spite of them.
That's a compelling argument, but I would frame it differently. In business, the Colosseum isn't just a filter. The chaos is the mechanism of speed.
No.
If you stop to build a safe Colosseum, you lose the war.
No, the chaos is a mathematical trap, and we have nearly a century of statistical science to prove it. Let's look at Abraham Wald, W-O-L-D.
The statistician?
Yes, during World War II, the military asked Wald, W-O-L-D, a brilliant statistician, to analyze returning American aircraft to figure out where to add extra armor. The military engineers plotted all the bullet holes on the returning planes and said, look, the wings and the fuselage are covered in bullet holes. The data is clear. We need to reinforce the wings and the fuselage.
Right.
Wald realized they were making a catastrophic, fatal error.
Right, because the planes that took hits to the engines didn't come back.
But Wald planes didn't have network effects. In tech, taking bullets to the fuselage is exactly what allows you to fly faster and capture the territory.
You are entirely missing the fundamental mechanism of Wald's discovery.
The bullet holes on the surviving planes simply showed where an aircraft could sustain severe damage and still manage to fly.
Well,
but the blitzscaling doctrine makes the exact same error as those confused military engineers. It looks at the bullet holes of successful unicorns, their chaotic internal structures, their massive operational losses, their fractured, toxic management, and it falsely prescribes those exact dysfunctions as the necessary armor for corporate victory.
But those traits are the direct byproduct of velocity. You cannot separate the speed from the chaos.
By demanding that velocity, this doctrine entirely erases the invisible graveyard. It ignores the base rate. There are tens of thousands of startups that read this exact book. They exhibited the exact same chaotic behaviors. They burned billions of dollars in venture capital, they tolerated bad management, they let the fires burn, and they went completely bankrupt.
But they are gone. Their voice is muted to zero in the dataset. By exclusively studying extreme anomalous outliers, the framework falsely attributes causality to reckless behavior rather than pure luck. Daniel Kahneman proved this comprehensively. A highly improbable gamble that pays off purely due to luck is almost always relabeled as a brilliant strategy in hindsight.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes these founders are just blindly rolling the dice and hoping for the best. Blitzscaling explicitly involves strategic phased transitions.
Phased transitions.
Yeah, it's not chaos forever. Hoffman writes that founders must act like pirates only in the initial phase. They move nimbly, they bypass slow incumbents, they break a few conventional rules to establish a beachhead.
Pirates.
Yes, it's like building an airplane while it's hurtling down the runway. Yes, it's chaotic, but if you stop to read the manual, you run out of tarmac. But, and this is crucial, as they reach what he calls the city or nation scale, meaning thousands of employees, they must transition into a disciplined navy.
A navy.
They build structure. They establish order and compliance.
You cannot build a foundation on deceit and instability and then magically flip a switch to become a disciplined navy. The problem is that instructing founders to operate like pirates directly incentivizes systemic corporate fraud.
Fraud?
Yes. It creates dangerous environments entirely devoid of structural integrity. Let's talk about Theranos.
Theranos is an extreme outlier of criminal behavior. Elizabeth Holmes was running a medical device company, not a software platform. It is a false equivalence to compare massive biomedical fraud to a standard application of tech scaling.
It is not a false equivalence. It is the absolute logical end point of this doctrine. The imperative to be first to market and to scale at all costs was so overwhelming that the fundamental viability of the blood testing product was treated as a secondary nuisance.
Well,
why did the board fail to audit the technology? Because blitzscaling demands you tolerate bad management. If you pause to implement rigorous scientific testing, your growth metric drops, and the next round of venture funding vanishes.
that's a misapplication of the rules.
They used aggressive non-disclosure agreements and the threat of legal retaliation to maintain total secrecy, aggressively suppressing internal warnings about critical technological failures. And the investors, terrified of missing out on the next hypergrowth unicorn, entirely bypassed necessary technological audits. That operational darkness is exactly what blitzscaling mathematically forces when it demands speed over efficiency.
Hoffman explicitly warns against being a sociopathic criminal. He advocates for being an ethical pirate. You break conventional business rules, like how to structure a marketing department. You do not break federal law.
The framework advocates for an unethical, anti-competitive mandate regardless of legality. It relies entirely on what economists call the millennial lifestyle subsidy.
You mean the period where venture capital was essentially used to subsidize lower prices for consumers? I would argue that is a classic loss leader strategy.
It is not.
Groceries do it with milk to get you in the store. Tech companies did it with rides and deliveries to get you on the platform.
I am not talking about a discount on milk. I am talking about venture capital being weaponized as a digital bulldozer to artificially subsidize unviable unit economics.
Unit economics.
For our listeners, unit economics simply means the direct revenue and cost associated with a single unit of your business. One Uber ride, for example. In a rational market, you need to make more on that ride than it costs you to deliver it. These blitzscaling companies deliberately sold services drastically below cost.
To grow.
Why? Not because they had achieved some brilliant technological efficiency. They did it to intentionally starve out sustainable local incumbents.
But consumers directly benefited from those lower prices for a decade. It forced traditional, stagnant industries like the taxi cartels to finally modernize.
It is a capital-fueled siege, not competitive innovation. They flood a city with heavily subsidized rideshare vehicles or short-term rentals, bleeding billions of dollars in losses. They hand out $3 bills for a single dollar and call it growth.
They were building the network.
They do this until the traditional competitors who actually have to balance a ledger go bankrupt. And what happens once the exploitative monopoly is built and the competition is completely eradicated?
The prices normalize to reflect the actual cost of the service.
The subsidies vanish, and consumers are trapped in an ecosystem of forced dependency. Look at the data. As soon as the era of subsidization ended, ride-hailing prices surged by an average of 40% in a single quarter. You aren't creating value. You are coercively extracting it by destroying the free market.
I have to push back there. The strategy of operating at a massive loss to gain dominant market share is as old as business itself. Amazon did it for years.
Amazon is an exception.
They operated on razor-thin margins or outright losses, reinvesting every single dollar to scale their infrastructure. And today, they provide immense, undeniable value through Amazon Web Services and their global logistics network. The book clearly asserts that blitzscaling can work in good times and bad times across different economic cycles, provided a company can secure the capital to outgrow competitors.
And that specific claim has been entirely invalidated by macroeconomic reality. This doctrine is not a timeless law of business physics. It is purely an artifact of the 0-0 ZIRP era.
The zero interest rate policy following the 2008 financial crisis. You're arguing the environment created the strategy, not the other way around.
Exactly. Let's explain the mechanism of ZIRP. Following 2008, central banks slashed interest rates to near zero. For over a decade, money was essentially free.
Right.
Institutional investors, pension funds, and sovereign wealth funds were desperate for yield because they couldn't get returns in traditional bonds or savings accounts. So they poured unprecedented trillions of dollars into venture capital.
To chase growth.
In a normal, historically average economic environment, capital is a constrained and expensive resource. You have to prove your unit economics, you have to generate free cash flow, meaning you actually have more cash coming into the business than going out. But under ZIRP, the cost of capital was zero. Raising money became the business model.
You can dismiss it as ZIRP, but that low-interest era funded the infrastructure of the modern web. Capital was cheap, so aggressive founders used it as a tool to build the future faster. They pursued massive, disruptive scale that simply wasn't mathematically possible in the 1990s.
It allowed them to completely detach from fundamental economics. The mandate was no longer to build a sustainable business. The mandate was to convince the next investor to fund a progressively larger valuation round. Without access to infinite free capital, the mathematical infrastructure of blitzscaling instantly collapses. Let's look at the ultimate anatomy of this collapse: WeWork.
WeWork is a fascinating case study in hubris. But again, one could easily argue Adam Neumann, NYOME simply failed to transition from pirate to Navy.
He didn't fail to transition, he followed the rules.
He never built the compliance structures Hoffman mandates for a mature company.
WeWork followed the blitzscaling methodology to absolute perfection. They secured hypergiant funding rounds from the SoftBank Vision Fund. They expanded globally at a literal lightning speed, opening hundreds of locations.
Yes, they did.
$8 billion in revenue. But because they were scaling so recklessly, precisely as the framework commands, they lost $1.9 billion in the exact same year.
Their costs were huge.
Every time they grew, they bled faster. There was absolutely no clear path to profitability.
Which is precisely why Hoffman differentiates between the types of businesses that can sustain hypergrowth. Real estate is a notoriously low-margin, capital-intensive business, unlike pure software, which has near zero marginal costs. WeWork was misapplying a software framework to physical desks.
That entirely ignores the fact that the venture capitalists, the board, and the founders willingly treated it like a tech company precisely because the blitzscaling doctrine provided them the academic cover to do so.
Academic cover?
Because the doctrine explicitly forgives chaos in the name of speed, it mathematically discouraged the board from looking at the unit economics. It provided an impenetrable shield for systemic grift.
Adam Neumann engaged in highly unethical financial maneuvers in plain sight.
Right, the trademark.
He personally purchased the trademark for the word we and sold it back to his own company for $5.9 million. He collected personal rent on properties he simultaneously leased back to WeWork. When you publish a book telling young leaders to embrace chaos and tolerate bad management, you do not get innovation, you get Adam Neumann.
But the system ultimately worked. The public markets looked at WeWork's S1 filing, saw the fundamental flaws in the unit economics, and completely rejected the valuation. The market corrected itself and refused to subsidize the grift.
It corrected itself by incinerating billions of dollars of institutional capital. The post-collapse market cap was $40 million, down from $47 billion. That is not a correction, that is a crater.
Well, markets fluctuate.
Without the artificial subsidy of ZIRP, the structural rot of these blitzscaled operations becomes undeniable. Look at the vast herds of unprofitable unicorns today. The moment interest rates ticked up to 5%, the music stopped. They have spent the subsequent years fighting off bankruptcy, undergoing massive down rounds, and engaging in severe workforce reductions. They are entirely incapable of achieving baseline profitability in a normalized high-interest rate environment because their foundational DNA is built on burning cash, not generating it.
Okay, let's step back and look at the broader picture here. I think any rational observer can agree that the macroeconomic environment has undeniably shifted. Capital is no longer free, and the threshold for sustainable unit economics is much higher today.
Yes.
But perhaps we can view blitzscaling not as a universal, immutable law of business physics, but as a highly situational tool. It is a tool that, yes, requires incredibly careful management, a hyper-awareness of its immense risks, and a very specific set of market conditions to deploy effectively. When the market is right, when the capital is available, and when the network effects are genuine and defensible, the first scalar advantage remains a powerful economic reality that founders simply cannot ignore.
Absolutely not. I reject that compromise entirely. Blitzscaling was never a roadmap for genuine value creation. It is, and always has been, a methodology of value extraction.
Extraction?
It actively rejects the arduous, unglamorous work of genuine innovation, the rigorous scientific testing, the alignment with civic infrastructure, the incremental, sustainable integration into society. Instead, it relies on rapid financial engineering. It privatizes massive financial gains for a highly insulated elite class of venture capitalists and early founders, while ruthlessly socializing the immense economic, urban, and operational costs of its inevitable statistical failures. To adopt these principles today is not an act of entrepreneurial bravery. It is to willingly embrace statistical ruin. Use this knowledge to build your mental immunity, and remember to subscribe to Cognitive Dose.